Welcome to AIR4VR Counselors. I'm Dr. Olivia. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are joined by Dr. Kathleen Oertle. Dr. Oertle is an associate professor of rehabilitation counseling in the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation Counseling at Utah State University. Dr. Oertle holds a master's in rehabilitation counseling with an emphasis on supported employment and transition services, and a PhD in special education. She is a certified rehabilitation counselor and a licensed vocational rehabilitation counselor in the state of Utah. Dr. Oertle is a first-generation college graduate and has a deep personal drive to promote inclusion and eliminate discrimination associated with disability, as she, her father, and paternal grandmother all acquired disabilities. Dr. Oertle's research topic is on transition, which focuses on progression of youth and students with disabilities from secondary education to post-secondary employment, education, and living. Among her transition research projects, Dr. Oertle and her research team are developing a transition-relevant collaboration competencies for use among special educators and rehabilitation counselors. Collaboration for Change, or C2, is one of 5 field-initiated development projects funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, Rehabilitation Research, and Rehabilitation Research. She was also a guest editor in 2019 for a special issue on transition published in the Journal of Forensic Vocational Analysis. Dr. Oertle also serves as on the Utah Special Education Advisory Panel and on the Utah Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor Licensure Board. She is a busy woman, but contributing great things to the state of Utah and rehab in general. Dr. Oertle also loves nature, animals, and people, to which she dedicates all her time and energy. Dr. Oertle, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and welcome to our podcast.
Well, I appreciate you asking me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So let's get started. The first question I always ask my wonderful guests is for you to share your journey into the VR profession, and when we say VR, for those who might be listening, we're saying specifically vocational rehab. As we noticed, we recently got a lot of comments about VR also standing for virtual reality, and we're like, no, we're talking about vocational rehab. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your journey into becoming the professional that you are today.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for, again, asking me to be here and asking me about my story. Like many people that come into the field of rehabilitation counseling, be it vocational or rehab in other settings, I was recruited. So I was working as a veterinary technician. I thought I was going to be a veterinarian at one point in time, and I have an undergrad degree in animal science, and I also pursued then an associate's degree in veterinary technology. So I was working in the field of medicine with animals, and some professors that were part of the University of Illinois had been clients with their dogs at our clinic for a period of time. I'd known them for about 2 years, and they knew that I was interested in getting into a helping profession. We'll call it that. I thought social work was the way to go. You mentioned in the intro, I'm first generation college, a college kid. And, I spent a lot of time with my guidance counselor thinking about the future and what I do and all these things. And, animal science seemed right, and veterinary medicine, because I loved animals, like you mentioned. And I love science. But what I found is that for me in the journey, as I went on that journey, I ended up stopping eating meat. And I was in the animal science, which is about animals and food and all these things. And, I was sort of in the space of what am I going to do? And I thought social work was the way to go, because my cousin was studying social work, right? And it had something to do with people. At the same time, right before I started my undergrad, my dad had a car accident and was paralyzed from the waist down as a result of it. which, obviously impact my family in pretty significant ways.
Okay.
Rehab counseling was involved, but it
Yeah.
was the workman's compensation side of things because my dad's accident happened during work. And so workman's comp had come in and, helped remodel the home and do all these things. This is long before I was thinking anything about social work or rehab counseling or any of these things. This is my lived experience, right?
Yeah.
And then here I am working as a veterinary technician, float forward in time. And they start talking to me about rehab counseling and telling me all these things rehab counselors could do. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Those are the people that help my family, but I didn't know that's what they were called, right?
Yeah.
I didn't really. And my dad did his rehab at Northwestern Memorial in Chicago, which is a pretty high known rehab facility for especially physical disability rehab, right? So he had spent a significant time there, months actually. He wasn't released from the hospital until my graduation, just to come
Mhm.
home for that night and go
Yeah.
back, right? So my family had experienced all this stuff. I saw these wonderful people, what they did, and all these things, and from everything from OTPT to counseling and these things. So it was all starting to come together like, oh, wow, this is a profession. There's a way you can study it even and do
Yeah.
stuff with it. And at the time, I thought I'd do something with animals and rehab counseling, like to combine it. I still think someday. It hasn't happened yet, but maybe, it just hasn't been on the radar as close as it needs to be with support employment and, the transition focus that I've had. But, to be done and,
Continue.
future things. Yeah, so my journey was both personal, right, because of my experiences with my dad, but my grandma, she had developed a physical disability early on in my childhood and walked with a walker. It was just kind of how life was, right?
Yeah.
I have to mention too, my dad's accident happened before the ADA was passed. So,
Mhm.
because I'm a little older, so there wasn't things like ramps or automated doors or, any of the accessibility kinds of things that we come to expect now, even though we still have challenges, right? So I was in this space of really coming to this awakening that there's this profession that actually works on issues around equity with disability. And
Mhm.
that there are really significant challenges when we think about inclusion. And I had lived all those things, with my dad and my grandma, and then later having my own accident as a in my undergrad. I had a motorcycle accident and created a space where I think about, right, like what's a head injury and what's that do, and all these things. I don't know. It was really weird. And I would have these moments once I had come into rehab counseling, my coursework, and I'm like, they're talking about my family.
Yeah.
As we're reading the research and stuff, I'm like, huh, that's weird. That's just like what I'm experiencing. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's this whole thing. So like a lot of people say about rehab counseling, I feel like it found me,
Mhm.
as much as I found it. And there was this match there, and I've had the experience of just having good people, when you think about what's been impactful, I'll kind of skip to that. It's the people, the mentors and the opportunities to be a mentor for folks, people seeing things in me that I didn't really see and, offering opportunities. The other piece, and I would be, that comes with that is the scholarship funding. I was an
Mhm.
RSA scholar. So my master's program in rehab counseling was funded through rehab services. I worked for 8 years and then came back for my PhD in special ed, but it was funded through rehab counseling services because I was on a training grant that provided training for 6 states in the Great Lake regions, and that funded my doc program, right? So the opportunities that came from the relationships and people seeing things in me, right, and supporting me, encouraging me, but then the funding too, right, made it possible because I am a first college level graduate, right?
Yeah. And I'm glad
The
you're touching on the piece about funding because I feel like that is part of accessing education,
Mhm.
period. And I would kind of throw in a little bit of my story. So
Oh
even
yeah,
though
please do.
my master's is not in rehab counseling, we had a clinical rehab program at the University of Memphis. And I remember all the students that were in the program were fully funded. And I was like,
Mm,
how? How are you all fully
right.
funded? And now being on this end, I understand like,
Mhm.
the lab that they worked in because the University of Memphis has a rehab clinic, and it was fully funded through, RSA training grants, and the
Mhm.
students worked in the lab. So then there were GAs and they were fully funded.
Right.
And with like this podcast is art RSA grant that's funding this project. And I have two GAs who they're not rehab counselors, they're, clinical mental health counselors, but they're getting the opportunity to learn more about rehab,
Right.
and
Yeah.
vocational rehab experiences while also being supported.
Yeah.
So I do like, I have come to really appreciate the vocational rehab world, because when you're talking about inclusion, this is the true definition of inclusion. It's like, we're not just going to you know create programs and trainings, but we're going to go to the government, secure funding to train our, vocational rehab students, to train our professionals, to support our current professionals. And because at the end of the day, if you don't have ways to pay for access,
Mhm.
you're going to have limited people who are going to be interested in the field. So,
Right. Yeah. And the whole thing too, I mean, that, and you mentioned it even as you talked about how the funding creates this space for networking, right? A place for you to build relationships with professionals in the field, other scholars, right? Opportunities for work for yourself. I mean, so many things came from that, because I traveled, we traveled across the Great Lake regions to all the states in those regions doing training,
mhm,
and that was extremely valuable to not only get out there and practice the craft, right, but at the same time building those relationships with people. And I can tell you, some of those folks were involved in my dissertation work later and
mhm,
still are involved in my research now, and I've been here 9 years. So we're talking like 12 years since my doctoral work, right? So
yeah,
that all came from building those opportunities, and with that funding that was providing training, meeting the mission of what rehab counseling, the Rehab Act, and what RSA and rehab counseling is about. It also gave me a chance to get to know what rehab services is about and how it operates, and the value of the individuals that are part of that. The importance of understanding what they're trying to do and how we're working together, because that's come to help me now, as a faculty member who has had a number of RSA grants now, training scholars, right? I mean, I'm on the other side of it, that pay it forward. And our students know I'm an RSA scholar, right? They understand that that's important to me, and that this continuation of this support for the purposes of the Rehab Act, for it to the actualization of it to occur, this
exactly.
must happen together, right? So I don't know, I'm definitely in, and I'm a scholar. I can't. Both my master's and my PhD, was funded, and I did have the service payback, right? So I had the obligation of working in the field to pay it back through service, which I gladly did.
Yeah.
You know? And for me too, I want to just say, when I hear clinical and mental health, and to me, it's all rehab counseling. So you hear me sort of separate vocational and whatnot. It's rehab counseling for me, because where I was trained, there's no separation, right?
Mhm,
So I was trained in a rehab counseling program funded through RSA. I worked as a mental health counselor when I first got out in substance abuse dependency, the whole what they call co-occurring now
mhm.
conditions. That was where I started, right? And where I worked for years before I ended up going back for my PhD, because transition happens there too. Work happens
Exactly.
there too. Inclusion's a concern there too.
Yeah.
It's
No,
all in the same
I
space.
completely agree with you, which this is why I got so excited when,
Oh
the
yeah.
merging of K Crab and Core. I was like, finally, I
Oh
was exposed
yeah.
to rehab because my master's program had clinical mental health school and clinical rehabilitation counseling as a track.
Right. Yeah.
Other
We ought to work
counseling,
together.
yeah, other counseling programs, there's less rehab, programs than they are clinical mental health in school. But yet, as we know, who are going to especially school counselors, they're at the front line. You're dealing with students who are receiving, vocational
Right.
rehab services. So to me,
Yeah.
it's integral for you to be knowledgeable and be able to advocate for those students too. So am completely there with you. It's, you can have your concentration, but it's important for those of us who have a counseling background, period, to appreciate all the different, like you have an appreciation for clinical mental health, for
Yeah, and
school,
having
rehab.
been, right, I 100% agree with that, having been the only rehab counselor trained in these settings, right, that I'm
Mhm.
talking about. Very different kind of training, right, in the
Yeah,
ways that, and I did treatment planning and all those things, but it ought to have some kind of purpose. It's not just about some kind of goal and a treatment plan, right?
mhm,
This is a lived life by a person who, is valued, regardless of the background and things that have happened. The folks I
exactly.
worked with, some of them had killed people, right? Like on serious level stuff,
Mhm,
drunken stupors, things happen. They'd served their time. My clientele were the folks that were coming out of the prison system, right? The
mm.
judge said, go see her.
Yeah,
They didn't choose to come see me. But what I would talk about is how can we work together in a space that is about, their life and making changes in ways that impactful for them. So they don't want to come see me again. Let's make it so you don't, right?
exactly.
That's the way I look at it, but it's always tied to work. I mean, it has to be. When we're grown, work has to be part of what we're talking about.
Mhm,
It's what we do. And that includes everyone from the most significant kind of challenges someone might be facing to the folks that don't seem to have, because we all have something that we're facing as a challenge in our life. For some
exactly.
folks, though, because of discrimination, and really, in some ways, protective discrimination, where we think because we know best for someone that,
Mhm,
these options aren't for them, or they're not able to work, or they're not this or that, especially for a young person that doesn't have capacity yet, right? Because they are not at the age of majority. They're not able to make decisions for themselves because of the law, unless for some reason they've got, been granted their own immunity, if you will, and capacity.
yeah,
In many cases, we're talking about young people where if rehab counselors get involved later in the planning, they may not even have agency because their rights have been already signed over as a guardian, right, to a
mhm,
parent or some other adult figure in their life, without a discussion of a supported decision-making plan or ways to support them based on task intensity and levels of support need, that it's just a given based on their disability category that they ought to have someone be the one that makes the decisions because they don't
exactly.
have capacity to do so. That assumption, just making that assumption alone, is so impactful in a way that changes everything for that person's life trajectory. And this is a place where rehab counseling, regardless of which affiliation, if it's clinical, mental health, vocational, whatever, if that person's a rehab counselor is really tied to the Rehab Act and this idea of inclusion and what our ethics say about autonomy and our support of folks and their right to be informed and make choices, we would be the person helping with that conversation right from the get-go. How do we start with the assumption of capacity
Mm.
and
But I
build
think,
from there as a
yeah,
potential through your life to grow to your full potential, right?
exactly. And I'm so glad we just made this transition to really start to talk about young people as they're
Mhm.
transitioning, right? So I know a good amount of your work has been around working with youth with disabilities who are in that transitional phase, right? So who are st- starting secondary education to post-secondary education with a focus on their education, employment, independent living, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have you share, like, what has that experience been like for you as you have worked, it's been the majority, good amount of your career focus on this particular population. I was just curious about what that has been like and what has been the most challenging part as a professional providing services to this population.
Okay, yeah. Well, so oh gosh, so many things, right? Um, First, I would clarify, as far as providing services, at this point, I educate folks to provide services, right? Or I support them to provide the direct service part of things, right? I'm an academic professional, so I'm not doing it directly at this
You're not on
point
the
in time.
front line anymore.
No, I'm not providing services, but the students, right, or the people that I work with in my research, obviously the folks that are part of the privy of our advisory boards, all of that, right, has to do with what's going on and the services being provided. A couple of clarification points I want to make, because it's, I think, really, to me, important to clarify to anyone that might be interested in transition, right, and particularly rehab counselors listening on transition. There was a huge impact for us as a whole when the reauthorization of the Rehab Act happened in WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, in 2016, right? So I'm sorry, 2014. And in 2016, the regs came out. So the regulations from RSA came out, which tell us a little bit more about how to, deliver, to implement what the law has said. People talk about a big change happening when the law was passed in 2014. Transition was already in the law, so that part didn't change, but there were more emphasis in what we're talking about, and a split of services to talk about a spectrum, or this idea of seamlessness in services, where pre-employment transition services was added to the law, right? Pre-employment transition services were already happening. That's the part I want to clarify. It's not separate from transition services, really, right? If we're thinking about these ideas of support systems and planning and preparing for life after secondary ed, high school, or whatever you might call it. Employment still is the primary outcome we're talking about, and it's pathways to employment. So the other one's the training part of it. In some cases, it's post-secondary education in a college or university, but that kind of training could be provided in all kinds of ways, right? That are pathways to employment, to the and training you need for employment. And these are ways we couch or start to think about what are the services that we provide and that we can bill for, right? The activities and services go together. Not all activities can be billed for, but some activities have to be done in order to get the services to the place where we can actually say, here's something we can bill for, right? That's leading towards one of these outcomes, employment or post-secondary ed in some training way that's leading to a post-secondary outcome of employment. Now, one of the things to think about when we're thinking about employment is that on the rehab counseling end, we talk about employment, or vocational rehab counseling, we talk about employment is the primary outcome. But on special ed, we talk about the big three, okay? And it's an or thing. So it is access to post-secondary education, independent living in your community, or employment as the outcomes, right? So when you ask about challenges, there's some challenges, and this comes out of the Individuals with Disabilities Improvement Act of 2004, right? So it's the parallel law to the Rehab Act and WIOA and the transition piece. And the thing is about that, then we've got this idea, right, when we come together to work together, that we're all have the same mission, that the outcome is about employment, when it isn't always, right? So because of that or thing, and especially if we get back to thinking that there are some people who may just have pretty significant challenges to go to work, that we might think about these other things as being the primary outcome. And for rehab counselors, that's unacceptable, right? I mean, it's like we can't accept, because of what the law says, that your outcome will be going to college. That's not an outcome, right? That's not an outcome, because going to college has to lead to something, right? Or being independent in your living, that's the outcome, right? Or facility-based work, or another word for sheltered work, is an outcome, because it doesn't fit with what the Rehab Act says, right? About inclusiveness in education, but also paths to inclusive employment. And specifically, we're talking about integrated competitive employment, right? And that's specific about what kind of pay, hours, right? What kind of environment a person might be in, that there are other people without disabilities, right? So there are some things there when we think about challenges, it's about talking about some of this and building those relationships so that just like when you and I are talking now, we just met today, right? But there were some things that, up front, talking about where we might have some common interest or some like-minded stuff, or even where we're different, right? When we're talking about mental health or vocational, we have a place now to build some conversation about what we'll do. And I think that's the way we think about challenges. We think about strategies and getting back to this human space, right? And I'm blushing because I can't help it. It's a Mr. Rogers thing, right? Getting to know the people in your neighborhood. I can't help it. We have to get out and get to know people. And even if it's in a virtual environment or on the phone or, low tech is good. A phone call is good, right? But different ways to get to know each other so that we're not coming to meetings. First time we ever met was in the meeting, right? I never even knew you. I came to the meeting because I was invited because I'm the rehab counselor in that particular area, or I happened to be assigned to that school, or, a parent invited me or something. But I haven't had a chance to meet any of the people at the table. And I don't know really why I'm here. I'm not really sure how I can help. And I'm figuring this out in the meeting. There has to be relationship building before that, right? So that there's some kind of space where we can think about, where we're like-minded and not, and how we can sort that out in ways that it's not being done in front of everyone, or after I leave the meeting and I'm super frustrated about why, or another option might be I was never invited anyway, and I found out about it later.
Yeah.
Or by the time they told me the schedule, there's no way I could put it into my schedule because I already have all these other things happening, right? So this coordination piece happens by building relationships, So I think it's the challenge and it's the strategy. It's getting to places where we talk through things and we really build upon that. Now, it's not to say there aren't things going on, right? So there's the Capacity Building Institute that's happening out of the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition Collaborative. There's your work, obviously, that's important. There's the work that WinTech was doing out of San Diego State and their collaborative. And, there's the rural projects out of Montana. There is a lot of work going on. Oh, I'm not even mentioning the labor side. So the Department of Labor has transition focused pathway. The whole guidepost to success comes out of there. Paula Kohlert's work with the taxonomy. So there's a lot of stuff happening, but it really comes back down to the humans getting to know each other, right? And building relationships, even with people you don't feel like you like. I'm serious.
No, and I love the honesty. And the way things are progressing with just the different guests we've had so far in this podcast, I don't know what's happening. Everybody's landing back on this relational piece, right? Everybody's like, yes, we can do this, we can do the trainings, we can implement this and that, but at the core of everything, we have to prioritize the relationships, because once you have that going, it becomes not saying that you're not, as you mentioned, it's not that you're not going to have any challenges, but it becomes a lot more it becomes a little bit easier to work through challenges if you are working through them with individuals and agencies that you already have relationships with.
Right.
And so,
yeah.
We already talk about that in counseling in general, like the importance of that relationship, like that therapeutic alliance with your clients. And so if we take it outside of that. So if we take it outside of the counseling space and we just look at it in general, anytime you're doing work with your client or on behalf of your client, if you're always coming from that relational space, so is it the school? Is it potential employees? You're going in and developing this, relationship, so that if you have a young person who might be interested in X, Y, and Z, you've already built that relationship. I mean, it might not be you specifically, but your agency has built that relationship in the community. So then you can go and have a conversation with Joe who owns the coffee shop because you have a young person who is interested in the food industry.
Right.
And so I'm
Yeah,
so
well,
glad you came
it's
back to that relational piece.
yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning all these important pieces of it. Yeah, so I mean, it's first of all, counselors aren't on their own, right? We work with people.
Mhm.
So because of that, it's taking that same frame, this working alliance, right? The idea of that we've got first belief that you care and value me, right? And that you think I can be successful. You know, it's not always like in that like space, you know, you still might have difficulties with me and stuff, but you know, that you really value and care. That's a primary, you know, it's this unconditional positive regard, bringing that into our space, right? And then the goal part of it and task part. I mean, it sounds simple when we talk about it, but it gets so complex, right? When we bring people together, especially if we haven't done that stuff where we've spent some time, you know, making observations in our communities about where jobs are. That doesn't even mean talking to anyone yet. You know, we like to talk about informational interviews, and I like to frame that as conversations, right? And there's work out there about community conversations now, Eric Carter's work, right? If we take this formal stuff out, if we just start to think about how do we get to know what's going on, right? Where are jobs? What's happening in my community? Where is things developing? Where aren't they? Where could a young person be impactful if there are no jobs? Yeah, I
Mhm.
hear rural communities say there are no jobs at all in our town.
Mhm.
None. Well, then why aren't we thinking about how to be entrepreneurial and, you know, really dive into what those kids want to do? And do they have ideas about how to revive the community? I bet they do. I bet they have a lot of them. Have you asked them? You know, so that's the big thing is how do we ask young people and their parents and families about how they can be as resourceful as we are? You know, this idea of a professional fixing the problem isn't in the Rehab Act. You know, there's no this parental kind of, you know, I know all the answer kind of thing. That's not the frame. You know, it's not the frame of rehab counseling, really. You know, we just talked about the working alliance. That's not me as the expert knowing what's right for you. But we approach oftentimes transition that way, as though somehow the family or the young people don't have anything to offer. And that's not true. You know, so there is a huge space where rehab counseling really can be impactful and is already when they dive into how do we build that untapped potential. This idea again, and I'm quoting stuff out of counseling, you know, Carl, yeah, Roger's work, when we think about unconditional positive regard and this idea of working through your whole lifetime to your full potential, right? You're born whole as is, no matter what the problems look like to someone on the outside, right? And especially for a young person, they're in development. You know, we are too.
Exactly.
But young
Ongoing.
people are, they're like, you know, they're in development in ways that are, you know, you mentioned early on about the impact a counselor could have. You know, we do have a life impact. We are impacting lives in ways that are about life and death. It just doesn't look like surgery, right? It just
Exactly.
doesn't look like, you know, public safety or something. It's a different way of caring about people, but it's about instilling the care of their own self, you know, so they see that there's something they have to offer, that they have a space in this place that's called life that's relevant, right? That we don't know the answers yet because they're in development. We have
Exactly.
no idea what someone's going to be. And I don't know what I'm going to be, let alone what someone else is going to be. So when we use assessments, we use these tools we have that are so great at giving us information. We need to help the young person and their families understand how they can use the tools to understand more about this whole thing and that they are the ones, right? Being informed, making choices and decisions and supported so that those skills go on in their own lives beyond us. I mean, I always think of it this way, we're trying to eliminate the need, but also have the door open that
Mhm.
they'll come back if they need supports as their careers advance, as they think more about, you know, how do I, now that I've got my first job, how do I continue to grow in ways that aren't about just I got a job, And now I have to stay in this job forever because I have that kind of disability nobody will hire, and I should be grateful. That's not the way we should think about things, right? I mean, and it's not a value thing that it's, Kat Oertle saying. This is embedded in our Rehab Act. It's what the Rehab Act tenets are.
Exactly.
About value of others. It's what's drawn me to stay in this profession, because I realize that I can instill things with others that then makes them, empowered in ways that, is well beyond what I could do by myself.
Exactly.
Well beyond, right?
Yeah. So I'm hearing you speak. It sounds like there's a difference between as a VR counselor or just a counselor in general, a difference between just checking off your to-do list of things to accomplish with your client versus helping through a collaborative process your clients make meaningful change. Because if I can help my clients make meaningful change, that's going to be long lasting. It's not saying that they will not need me or somebody like me in the future, but you are being intentional in the work that you're doing, that it has a meaningful impact. And how can I make meaning? I can't make meaning for you. That means I've taken the time to collaborate with you, with your caregivers, to make sure that I am supporting you in the best way for you, and not me as the expert coming in and telling you what you need to do or what's best for you.
You got it. And I've been influenced by researchers before me and mentors to me, right? So I want to just mention, Dr. Karen Sachs, for example. She's got a project called Take Charge, which shows a person-driven process in providing services and engaging family and young people. So, that's one place that's super impactful for me. But then I also think about folks who, man, along the lines with Karen, have laid the groundwork for thinking about how self-determination and self-advocacy are, infused in the work we do. Paul Wayman is one of those folks. And then also Michael Waymeyer. So Michael Waymeyer is the person that has a model on self-determined career development. And it's exactly what you're talking about, where we teach people, we like to call it critical thinking in our world, right? This idea of how do we access information and determine source of information and value and prioritize things, right? And then try it out, test to see what happens, and then ask ourselves, how well did it work? Was there anything else I needed to do? Do I need to talk to somebody else? Do I need more help? It's this kind of a, modularized kind of way of thinking through instruction, right? That special educators and even rehab counselors could engage in this process with young people, so that we're using this same frame we use in any counseling, but rehab counseling, to apply it in a space where we're bringing young people, to learn these skills, right? Modeling them for them, but also demonstrating through this engagement with them. And the same with families, right? So that there's not this opposition, this idea that we can bring families in a space where, and family I'm using as a broad term, where the young person and their folks around them decide what the family is, right? Who they are and what their support structure. That's why I mentioned Take Charge, because Take Charge helps us think about helping the young person and who they'd ask to be part of this. Now, I'm often asked with this stuff, is this the IEP meeting? Is this the individual education planning meeting? No, it could be, but oftentimes it's the preparation stuff before or the stuff that follow-ups after, right? So we've talked about the pre-meeting, this pre-meeting of people and relationships. There's also the follow-up stuff, right? So there's the post stuff. And then there's that meeting that happens that could be a transition planning meeting. It's a formal thing that's required by law. And, so all of this stuff has to be put together in a way that's a lot of different puzzle pieces. And it's not always in the same kind of order, right, for folks. So this, again, could be a place where, as counselors get connected and more informed and involved with relationship building and stuff, building from the relationships they have from adult services they've been providing, really can build these places where there's value added, that nobody else besides the rehab counselor can bring forward because of the orientation we have around inclusion, around supports, around thinking about how environmental, ecological impacts and this whole kind of space of supporting people, that it's not just one thing. When we're thinking about employment, it's all these things that go into life. But with that outcome in mind and building with a backward plan, with those support structures in place, right? It's not perfect. And like you said earlier, it doesn't eliminate the challenges for inclusion. My mentor and advisor, Dr. John Track, would always say to me, you can't mandate or legislate attitudes.
That's a good, that's
right. So
it's important.
Yeah, well, and it's important. That's because it's to remind ourselves, right, that just by having the law and these procedural things kind of laid out, it won't necessarily change outcomes unless we do have these human relationships, right, that we are making these things possible. Now, to add about COVID, you ask about that and its impact and whatnot. I don't think, from my point of view, and I think it's interesting you mentioned that there's this running kind of overarching theme across podcasts about relationships. I don't think that's by accident. I think it's because of what we've experienced through this process over the last couple of years, that relationships have become even more obviously important. That we need each other, right? That we are on the same planet together, and that if we want our communities, if we bring it back down to a micro level, if we want our communities to thrive, that we're engaged in that, right? That we reach out to other people for help, for support, for ideas, all these things. But our own well-being matters, right? That we have to start at a place where self-care is a priority and that it's done in a real way that's modeled. So those folks around you, your students and the people that you're supporting also are aware that that's what's actually happening. It's it's done on, a conscious level, intentional. It's part of what we're supposed to do anyway. It's in the code of ethics. Self-care and care of others is written into the rehab counseling code of ethics. So the CRC code of ethics, but I think it's been really made obvious to us that this is important to do and that we can't be impactful. We're never going to really see outcomes change in employment until we really, work together in a way that's about human beings coming together. And to me, my main goal is to see that gap in employment. So, any listener can go to the Department of Labor and take a look at the labor statistics. And what we see every time is that anytime the data changes for people without disability, it mirrors for people with disabilities, but the gap remains the same.
Yeah.
The gap remains the same. And here's the thing that I want you to hear that's super important from my point of view is that the peak employment for young people, let's take young people, peak employment, it is young people. For people with disabilities is, right around that 30-ish age range, peak employment, okay? And in the 30%, maybe 40, let's 42, sometimes it gets up to. That's peak employment. When we look at these buckets, right, they're never clean as far as disability and not disability, depends on who's disclosing and all these things. But when we look at the data, just as it is from the Department of Labor, and we look at the folks that don't, declare disability or at least labeled non-disabled, right? That group, their peak employment, that peak employment is around right before retirement age, right? So 55 to 65, and it's in the 80s. It's like 82 or something like that %. This is when wealth is being built, right? This is when all that stuff, when you're thinking about aging, you're building all this stuff so that when you get older, you can be cared for in ways that, You have some say, you've got your life still, you've got had a chance to be married and children if you want. You had a chance to, travel, buy a house, buy a car, like on and on, right? I'm not saying them in order necessarily, but that there's choice involved because employment helps us with that.
Mhm.
And some of us are lucky enough to have an employment that comes with benefits. And I mean retirement and vacation and, sick pay and on, right? We need to think about benefits in that way so that when we're talking about benefit planning, it's not about SSI and SSDI only, right? It's about how do we have benefits as a person with a disability in a way that is going to continue to support me through my life, not ask for more services from the government, as my only option, because I haven't been taught other ways to think about my life,
Exactly. Yeah,
right?
and again, I think also as I have gone in this journey to just be more involved and immersed in the rehab world from just being a co-PI in this grant, sponsoring this podcast, and also just as a professional, one thing that I can say being a little bit of an outsider to the rehab world, and just a citizen of this country, I feel that sometimes we as a society look at whenever there's a conversation, we're talking specifically with like young people making that transition to either education or employment or both, almost like as a favor, right? It's like you should be fortunate to
Oh,
have this
yeah,
opportunity. So I feel like if we look at it
yeah,
that way, if as a society and we as professionals are a part of this society, if that's the mindset that we're bringing into these professions, I feel like there's going to continue to be where we're only showing up at almost like, again, just checking off this to-do list and not thinking about the bigger picture, which again, I think for everybody, you mentioned Carl Rogers earlier about living a meaningful life. And it should not matter whether you have a disability or not. That should be the ultimate goal, period, as professional counselors working with clients, whether they have a disability or not where, oh, this person that I'm working with right now has a disability. So then all of a sudden the quality of life, I'm starting to kind of box them in, be like, well, let's just be, if we'll be lucky enough to find somebody to, give you an opportunity to like,
right.
if you were working with a person who does not have a disability and you're talking about career and career choices, you're probably are not going to limit them as far as your work and your desire for your clients to have that meaningful life that you're talking about. So I feel like that's part of, again, counseling programs. So as both of us are counselor educators, that might be something that we as counselor educators, we need to make sure that we are imparting onto our students about, how are you viewing your clients? When you're sitting across from your clients, are you
Yeah.
genuinely
Well,
working with them to maximize their potential? Or as soon as you see that they check that disability box, all of a sudden it's like, we're only going to focus here. And that's it.
yeah, and especially for a young person, right? This idea, and I think for adults too, but when we're talking about somebody who isn't even at 18 yet and have decided what their whole future is, right? There's not even a history yet of work or even trying to work yet.
Mhm.
And to decide about the kinds of experiences we might provide. So if we go to pre-employment transition, you're thinking about work-based learning, we might be limiting people to even exploring what the possibilities are because of the things we're thinking about potential, right?
Exactly.
So it ought to be, part of this humiliate, this idea of when we talk about cultural humility, right? It ought to be part of that conversation about how we think about, what we think we know, how we know it. We are passing professional judgment,
Mhm.
and we have to talk about this is a passing of judgment. We are doing that when we're
Mhm.
making decisions about what services we'll fund or not, how the plan will be, formed, how we even present things to people. So this idea of informed decision making and how do we support what information is shared and how we share it, at a level, the language they need, all the ways that we have to, according to the code of ethics, to make it accessible, right?
Exactly.
These things also mean about what we're choosing to share and not share, and why and when, right? Sometimes we also have to learn, and this with treatment planning, is that you can't share everything all at once because it's too much, right?
Overwhelming,
It's
definitely.
too much. Yeah, and that person, they're not going to ever come back. And I mean, there's just all kinds of things that'll happen, right? So we have to be thoughtful about how we share, but not stopping sharing because we think they don't have the capacity, right? Or their parents are, this or that, or fill in the blank, right?
Exactly.
Because this could be expanded beyond disability and become intersectional, right? Because it could be gender and race and socioeconomic and so on and so forth. This is very much like when I think about any kind of ways we have these presumptions, it's in that same space, right? About exploring that.
The exact same. And I'm so glad you went there, because even now, when you look at our like multicultural textbooks and things like that, when we talk about individuals with disabilities, it's always like, oh, and by the way, there's this other subgroup of people, and I'm like, but you're talking about anybody can either be born or acquire disability. It will cross gender, race, socioeconomic status, it doesn't matter. Religious beliefs, culture, this is not something that's isolated, like only these group of people will ever experience disability.
Right.
And so I do agree that it's literally, that should be a part of the conversation, because if you're in a room and you hear a counselor limit somebody's choice based on any of the other protected categories, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, so you would sit up, be like, hey, that is not appropriate, right? But yet with disabilities, I feel like we're almost still perpetuating that mindset, and we're almost like okay with it, be like, well,
Well, yeah. Well, and it's so, and the complexity, right, of trying to understand the orientation of where this person and their family is coming from, right? Because of what you just mentioned. Even the family orientation may not be the same, right? Or how they even think about disability in their family, or how they receive services or access services, or, right? So when we're thinking about transition, a rehab counselor has to think about the school setting, right? And that system, the educators, so special ed for sure, because they're our primary partners because of the mandates. But it's also the other part of the school system, the school counselors and the principals and the superintendents and the gen ed, the career and tech ed, right? Everybody in that system. But then you've got the young person, you've got their family. However, and then you mentioned earlier, a big part of our primary service space is the employer in the community too, right? And not when we use the word employer or business owner or businesses, that doesn't describe anything other than a term we're using, right? Because every employer is different, every business is different, right? So there's all these levels of having to get to understand and know what's going on. And that humility, I think, is super important, because how could you know all of that? You can't. You're going to rely on those folks to help you be the one that I feel like is often the hub of connecting all of this stuff together, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The person who, and persons, because some folks are lucky enough to have more than one counselor, not all of them, but some are, where you've got an opportunity now to share across these different points of view in ways that then the resources get richer and deeper, and ideas, like you said too, with the ideas that came out of the project you're on, with the different points of view being brought together, the richness gets deeper. The opportunities, ideas are more substantial. It's, I don't know, you can feel like the excitement I get from that, the potential, and for somebody young to have that kind of energy around them. That's why, look at Take Charge. There's videos, people could check it out. I mean, you can feel it's palatable,
It's
the
empowering.
way the person feels in that space, because they're supported from a strength-based frame, right?
Exactly.
Now, before we get too much further, a couple things I want to clarify. And this is, I can't help it. It's the school teacher in me. Yeah. Well, okay. So for the law end of things, I've been using young people often as the terminology because the law on our side, the rehab counseling side of the law, the Rehab Act and the way it spells things out, there's two groups of people that are defined as the primary customer or client. When we're talking about transition, and it's not to think about the adults right now, but the young people. So there's one set of group called students, and there's one called youth. Okay. The law talks about two different groups. But what has happened is, before the law came out in the way that it did in 2014, in the reauthorization, the Rehab Act in WOA, they specified youth and student. But before that, in the literature and everything, we would just use the word youth to mean pretty much everybody, right? And sometimes we use student as the catch-all term, but they're defined differently in the law. And for rehab counseling, it's super important because a student receives different kinds of access to services than a youth does or youth can. A student is a person still in school, okay? This is someone that might be receiving special ed services. They might be receiving supports under a 504 plan, but they might just be potentially eligible for rehab counseling services through the vocational rehab system. These are folks that can be served with pre-employment transition services. So those 5 transition, pre-employment from exploring to work-based learning, right, to post-secondary ed counseling, the stuff about, self-determination and advocacy, self-advocacy, right? And then the social skills in the workplace. That all is the pre-employment stuff, and that students can access that while they're still part of the student preview. They're still have to be in school, right? This could actually be in post-secondary school if they're still under the age of 22, right? So it goes to your 22nd birthday. Some states have different end age because they can make it longer. Michigan's known for having it go to 25. Okay, so states can make it longer, but typically we're talking about 16 to your 22nd birthday. Okay, when we're talking about youth are out of school. Youth are no longer tied to their school system. Okay, that's all it tells us. They're out of school, and that it's defined by ages 14 to 24. So it's from age 14 to your 24th birthday. Oftentimes, these folks could be part of a partnership that we would work with the workforce side of things, your one-stop centers, where the youth counselors are, where the old WIA, Workforce Innovation Act, right? I think that's what it was now. This is before WIOA, right? So out of school youth are the folks that are not connected to secondary ed or post-secondary ed, but they're out of school. Now there's a gray area the law doesn't talk about. There are young people who are in transition, who are no longer in their home school, but are in some other kind of alternative setting. Sometimes it's detention centers. Sometimes it's a state-run school. Sometimes it's in the jail systems, and they're receiving education from the state, not their local agency any longer. All right. But they're still considered a student.
Yeah.
They're not a youth out of school, right? So there's this kind of gray space. And we're really not in a space yet that we're serving those groups of students very well. The students that are in this space that are in the alternative settings. And we're certainly not in a space where we have really developed from the rehab counseling side, strong ways to support out of school youth yet. It's in works, right, in some projects. But for the changes in the law, it expanded the preview of what our audience is when we think about our primary customer. Because out of school youth really weren't part of what rehab counseling really thought about unless they were adults coming for services for employment, right?
Exactly.
some of these folks, because of the age, right, they're between 14 and 22, they're not adults. I mean, they aren't over the age of 18 if they're in that early part of things. And they're, so folks say, what are they doing? They're not working and they're not in school. That's what we know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So one project I want to mention is called MySIL. I'm on the advisory board for it. It's out of Mathematica's work. MySIL stands for My being minority youth, and SIL, the Centers for Independent Living.
Mm-hmm.
They're our partners too. So part of what rehab counseling does is work with Centers for Independent Living and also community rehab providers, right, to provide services in the community. The Centers for Independent Living, when the law was reauthorized, they also are responsible for transition now too. They weren't before.
Okay.
It's one of the services that they provide, and they receive funding to provide those services too. Now, because of the nature community supports, when we think about Centers for Independent Living, every community is going to morph into different ways to think about how they serve the young people or the youth in their communities. But it's certainly important to think about as a rehab counselor. Yeah, I've got a lot of work to do with the students, but there are also youth in my community that need services too, right? And are part of what the Rehab Act requires, or at least mandates. Mandates are included in the serving this group of people as well.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure.
No, I appreciate the clarification. No, I appreciate that you taking the time to make sure you're providing like that, again, that education piece to make sure that our listener, and also that's something I just learned as far as the different, I wasn't mindful that there was a difference in the rehab, when we're talking about rehab world, the difference between, again, whenever the term student is used versus youth. So I just learned very important, key of information there moving forward. So I want to pivot slightly because we've talked about this piece over and over again, this last part of our conversation. I want to make sure that we get to it before we wrap up our time today. With your current project that you're working on with your research team around the competencies that you are developing, right? And if I'm not mistaken, it's entitled Collaborate for Change.
Yeah, Collaborate for Change. Yep.
Please, can you elaborate? Can you share with us about this project, where you are, and how did you land here in developing these competencies?
Okay, cool. Thank you for asking about that. All right, yeah. So, excuse me. We were myself and Dr. Karen Sachs out of San Diego State University were funded through the National Institute on Independent Living. Disability and Independent Living Rehabilitation Research, otherwise known as NIDLR or NIDLR, depending on how you're pronouncing it. We received a field initiated grant. So it's pretty cool. In fall of 2019, thank you very much. We're getting to the end of our project now, so it wraps up at the end of September of this year. And what we've been doing is working on building competencies specific to transition and collaboration among transition specialists broadly, which is defined more specifically as special educators and rehab counselors who are responsible for transition in their state. So we've been working with statewide leaders in transition. I use that word broadly because they have different titles in their state, but you could say each state has two, one over special ed, one over rehab counseling, right? And that they're the person responsible in their state for helping support educators and counselors in their state to do transition. So they provide support around policy, practice, procedures to do the training. They're not the director in their state, right? But they're the person that does the statewide leadership for transition. So we've been working with them on thinking about what would be most important or essential in standard operating procedures for collaboration. So not exceptionality, not these projects, a demonstration that are important, but how could we think about this in a way that it isn't exceptional, right? It's a collaborative orientation. And I approach everything from what I do as a collaborator. And how do I do that if I'm a rehab counselor or a special educator, right? And the two, because they're mandated, how do they come together to then educate and serve people in transition, be it a student or a youth and their families, right? So we've been working on taking the things we've known in the field. We started out with 79 items that were all these evidence-based practice, right? And levels of evidence varies from I think it's good to there's some evidence of an outcome change, right? Mostly I think it's good, but and I've had some examples of change happening, but wide change hasn't yet been happening because we can see that in the outcome data. And so we've taken those items and we spent, Ellie, now the last 2.5 years with these statewide leaders across the country. And we did a modified Delphi to start with, where they went through these competencies that were out there and we whittled them down to the essentials. They provide descriptions and examples in the field of what they mean by these. And again, it's not just delivering a service, it's collaborating on the service. And we're down to 21 items now that are essential in this work. And then we spent the last about 6 months or so, 8 months, doing focus groups with the statewide leaders, having them talk about the model of competency. So there's a model that frames the how and the what. So the how is the mechanism for collaboration and the what is what we do in transition. And it's bringing those two together so that folks have a frame for what is it we do when we come together and we do this work in a collaborative way. I'm excited to say 29 states were involved and also DC and our territories out there. So it's wide reaching. We had 51 statewide leaders participate and pretty even across special ed and rehab counseling. We had some states with both special ed and rehab counseling, but not all, right? So that says something about what's going on with collaboration out there, that sometimes it's special ed or rehab counseling that's at the table and the other partner isn't there, right? So it's been really exciting to bring folks together to talk about these things and to bring the information forward in order to really get at how we can do this work in a collaborative way. How we can address things like COVID or any situation that comes up in a way that we're reusing our resources and our skills as partners in ways that are impactful and meaningful. So I can tell you, we've got a set of constructs that talk about like the spaces where we can work together around assessment and preparing and connecting things. There are item level statements of collaboration, competencies, and then examples that they've given us about what work they're doing and where we can continue to develop things further. We're in the last stages of analyzing the focus group data right now, and we'll start to, in the spring, do some SWOT analysis with the state directors, both on special ed and rehab counseling, because we're working with the association. So the association on the special ed side and the association on the rehab counseling side that oversees or at least helps support the directors across the state. And then we'll be doing field testing at the last leg with 3 states that we'll identify specifically to test at the counselor and educator level, because right now we're at the statewide leader level. Right?
Yeah.
No one had done research with them. To me, I don't know. So we have for Dr. Karen Sachs and I have been working with them now, I think since 2014 or something, talking to them about the challenges, the incentives for collaboration, ways they can be supported to do their work, how they can come together as leaders to share ideas. All of the work had been done at the counselor and educator level. None at the supervisor leader level. So anyway, we're trying to bring those two together by working with this particular audience.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Go ahead.
No, I was saying it sounds really exciting, especially when we started this conversation talking about like how important it is to have that collaborative spirit, like we can't function in silos. We're gonna have to, one, step out, nurture these relationships, be intentional, and all of that is helping us collaborate with people, entities, agencies. And so that's really exciting to hear. And I definitely, I'm going to keep an eye out on when you all finally publish and kind of check it out and see where you all landed, because it's pretty exciting.
Cool. I appreciate that. We have some work out there published for the stuff that built, the argument for having the grant and whatnot. So there is some stuff out there folks can look for if they're interested. But what I would leave you with is that there's some presumptions or assumptions space that it rings true and important across both special ed and rehab counseling. And that's the conversation over and over again, as you were noticing, with the podcast, there's some kind of running themes, right? With it. It's the same with our discussion with the statewide leaders. And, one of the things is having early and high expectations for work. Early and high expectations for work, right? And engaging students and youth in the process, not just what we're calling self-determination or self-advocacy. So like you were saying, checking the box, right? Or teaching a module or having an experience. I led my meeting. Really engaging students and youth with disabilities in this process, like we've been talking about for this time, right? And then the other part is, how do we really involve parents and families? And, so you heard this throughout the talk, this comes from the research.
Exactly.
It's what we hear over and over and over and over again. How do we do this in a way that's meaningful under those particular guidance, right? These presumptions that early and high expectations for work matters, because it matters about what then we decide to do or not do, right?
Exactly.
And this idea too about how do we engage youth and students in ways that's not, a checklist kind of thing, or kind of in a space where they just were present, but not really in, and we can't just assume engagement without instruction and without support services to do that, right?
Exactly.
So it has to be part of the planning process. And then the thing too is like really valuing parents and families, but also recognizing they need support too. And how do we coordinate that in ways that they understand what resources are available? And how do we talk to them in ways that are not parental, right? Or paternal towards them, helping them understand what kinds of supports they could access to, have their own opportunity to work and be engaged and all these things, right? Seen as a value, seen as important.
Exactly. Like the theme over the course of our conversation today has been talking about meaning, like having meaningful experiences, having, creating meaningful experiences for the young people that our VR counselors are working with, having that collaborative spirit. And always remember, yes, we are professionals in the field, we're providing a service, but we are not an expert of the person. We're there to provide professional services, but the person who are receiving the services and their family, they're the experts, of around their own life, on their kids as well. So I think, and I've done a lot of work with adolescents. I do a lot of I've done a lot of family work when I do practice clinically. And that is a theme that I have gotten so many times when I get families, especially like just parents who are tired, right? They've been looking for counseling services and they're like, I am at my wit's end. And most of those negative experiences with professionals come from when a professional comes in and there's this hierarchy, like, I'm the professional, I'm going to tell you what needs to happen, versus coming in and doing that needs assessment and be like, hey, what do you need? And how can I as a professional with, and again, we have credentials, we have training, we have expertise, but then how do you put that professional knowledge and experience and training and leverage it to work and support our clients. Again, everything that meaningful experience. And I think it goes back to Carl Rogers, like that unconditional positive regard for our clients. If you can always see and validate that personhood of the person sitting in front of you and their caregivers, there's no way that you would struggle to then allow that collaborative spirit to come out, because then I'm seeing you as an equal. Like, just because I have all these letters behind my name doesn't mean I'm better than. It just means that I know a lot about a very specific area. I have a path,
right? So, yeah.
I have a lot of training and knowledge around this little pin where if this is like the knowledge, all things that we know about just in life, you put a little pin right here. Like, I know a lot about this little area,
right.
And that knowledge can be of help, but it doesn't mean I know what's best for you. It means I have a lot of knowledge and I can use my knowledge and training to support your growth, but I cannot tell you like, okay, this is what you need to do. You can't. We got to step away from that.
Right. Well, it's dangerous territory. It's dangerous for so many reasons, but mostly because we have no idea. Yeah. And even if we gave the best advice, we don't know that that's going to work out exactly the way we were thinking. It usually doesn't. And and I've been pleased to say it usually works out in ways that I couldn't have imagined, and it was better.
Exactly.
Once I was okay with the change in my plan and all, accepting that that's going to be how it is, and getting into a space of being able to move on that. I think you said it really well. This idea of somehow the professional knows, even with all the training we have, we know a lot about a specific thing. And even if we have life experience that is somewhat similar and stuff, it's still a different lens. It's not their lens. And, it devalues them to think somehow we know. But I also feel like it devalues us and what our real added value is, because we're spending our time in a space that's about controlling what they're doing, as opposed to providing education and services. That's a very different thing.
Exactly.
It's than telling you what to do. It's very, very different.
Exactly.
And I do want to say too, I am, a couple of people I'm influenced highly by that I should just mention outside of the academics. These folks are in my academic life too, but I feel like, I don't know, when we think about rights, disability rights, and this idea of, because we haven't said those words, but we're really talking about it. Folks that have been in my life now for the last, I don't know, Curtis Richards is one of the persons I'm thinking of. He's been a colleague and friend of mine now for probably 5 or 6 years. I was introduced to him by Karen Sachs. He was part of developing the guideposts for success. So out of the Department of Labor side of things, he's a person, living with a disability. He's blind, and he talks about his early journey and folks telling him he couldn't be a journalist because he's blind, right? So I just think that's something that's important to think about, is that, he's now retired. He's lived a life engaged in government and journalism and all these things. So I don't know. I think there's always people, and not exceptional examples, but lived examples of people who, live their life despite folks saying they couldn't, right?
Exactly.
Most of us have done that in some way. The other person's Judy Human. She's become a friend of mine over the last couple of years through Curtis, because they're friends. And, Judy's work led to the Rehab Act being signed. Okay. It's shocking. At 23 years old, right? She was protesting to get the Rehabilitation Act signed, back in the 70s. But she talks about lying to rehab counseling because she wanted to be a teacher, and she heard through the grapevine, rehab counseling won't let you be a teacher because they've never seen a teacher with a disability.
Wow.
And so she told him she'd be a speech language pathologist. That's because where people with disabilities might be, right? That's the way she thought about it. She became the first teacher in New York to have a disability. And she had to fight court cases. And, Brown versus the Board of Education was part of the law that helped her become a teacher, because she had polio and used a wheelchair. They said she couldn't be a teacher. She's a fire hazard. To me, it goes back to what you said before about how we frame our thinking about what we think about others. Yeah. And if we're focusing on ourselves and, our own self-care and strengths and becoming a better us, I think we'd spend less time on the problems that others have and how we might fix them.
Yeah. But I know we're coming towards the end of our time together, so I wanted to give you an opportunity for any final words of wisdom that you would like to live, kind of wrap up our conversation and live with our listener.
Ooh, words of wisdom. I don't know. Well, I hope anyone that's listened to us talk today, has some things they can take away, and the big one I would like to leave folks with is that you all have something to contribute. You all do. And you're adding value with the work that you do. So I applaud that. And I encourage you to continue and certainly reach out to those around you, closer, in your community, your agencies, your work setting, the people around you that support you, but certainly out further to the projects that are there, like the one that this is being broadcast from. And, rehab counselors and special educators, folks in helping professions have a tendency to, say yes when you reach out for help. So I would suggest, that you do that. And the main thing is take care of yourself. It's super important. You matter. You do matter. And then, because of that, remember why you were drawn to counseling to begin with, and use that same kind of care, across the board. So a holistic way of caring, which includes you too. So that would be my final words, for this time together.
Thank you so much. I feel like this conversation has been so wonderful. And I appreciate everything that you shared with us today. A lot of educating, which I love, speaking to the law and the policies and things like that, because again, that's important. It's important for us to know and to be mindful. And thank you for ending on the note of self-care, because I feel like that's always been important, but definitely right now with everything that's going on, we have to amp it up even more, because my goodness, have we been through it this past 2 years? And so I echo what you just shared. For all of our listeners, make sure once you wrap up this podcast, this episode, step away and do some self-care. And also remember why you decided to pursue this profession, and allow that to continue to fuel your passion for the work that you do. And I definitely agree. Thank you for the work you continue to do in the community around the country.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. And this has been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure having you this afternoon.
Just one last thing. I need you all. So take care of yourselves. I need you. So.
Yes.
All right. I do. All right.
Well, thank you.